Today, I am going to continue my teaching on the five paths. I've already talked about the first path, which is the path of accumulation. Today is going to be on the path of juncture. These first two paths are considered ordinary because they depend on conceptuality rather than direct experience. And through practice, doing various types of examination and so forth, these two paths prepare us for what could be called the real path, which starts with the actual experience of emptiness. And these last three paths are considered superior because they depend on an experience that we have never had before. The last three paths are the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and then the last one term for it is the path of no more learning. And it is, of course, full Buddhahood. So we're working with our confused state of mind and trying to accomplish a non-confused state of mind. Sometimes that non-confused state of mind is called ordinary mind because we do not add conceptuality to that ordinary mind. Through our aspirations, our devotion, and our practice on this path, we gradually try to experience emptiness and to have other experiences. But no matter what our experiences are, they are not the real thing. They merely prepare us for experiencing emptiness. So this is the path of junction between the path of accumulation and the path of seeing. There are four contemplations that are used on this path of juncture or junction. And I'm basing my teachings partially on teachings that Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche has given, and also Tralag Rinpoche. There are other ways to describe this path, but I'm going to use this one. It's very straightforward and easy to understand. So it uses the Four Noble Truths to kind of guide us through this path of junction. And each of the four truths have meditations and contemplations, including insight meditation, that are associated with them. And these meditations and contemplations are associated with suffering, impermanence, emptiness, and selflessness. The first is the truth of suffering. So the contemplation is to think about the three types of suffering that the Buddha talked about. The first one is conditioned suffering. All suffering is the result of causes and conditions. Things don't just happen. Things are not caused by a God or a higher being that has the power to have good things happen to us if we behave the right way, and bad things happen to us if we misbehave. Part of conditioned suffering is that change is inherent to a conditioned existence rather than stability. And of course, we want stability. We want predictability. We want things to remain the same when we have pleasant and happy circumstances, but they don't last. Basically, we have unrealistic expectations. And of course, one good example of things not lasting is approaching old age or becoming old. No matter what you do, no matter how much surgery you have and Botox you use and how often you go to the gym, do yoga, and so forth, you still age. We can do things that can lengthen life, that can prolong life, that can lengthen or increase the quality of life. But you can't avoid old age. It's that simple. Another way of stating this is that doctors prolong life. They don't save lives. The second is the suffering of change. Just kind of comes out of this first suffering of conditioned existence, that we think that our condition will improve if we change our situation, that if we do something, we will develop more satisfaction, less suffering, and so on and so forth. We like to think that things will get better, although there are some people that think from you might say, a negative point of view and thinking that things will always get worse. One of my farmer jokes is a farmer can say it's too hot, or it's too cold, it's too wet, or it's too dry, or it's too good to last. Needless to say, things change. And no matter what's going on in our mind, we cannot manipulate change. It happens. And we cling to things thinking that they're supposed to be a certain way, they're supposed to last. And meanwhile, we've got this internal dialogue going on inside of us, telling us all kinds of things about what should be happening and what we would like to happen and our expectations, and on and on and on and on and on. The bottom line is that the good times do not last forever, and that no matter how stable we feel our situation is, you never know. One of the things that brought me to Buddhism was the death of my best friend in an accident, and he died quite healthy up until the time of the accident. Within a few years, I lost two other friends that also died in accidents. So no matter what you do, we really do not have the control that we seek over change. The third is the suffering of suffering. And I've heard this described a number of different ways. This is the way I chose to describe it this time. We're already suffering, and then change happens and more suffering comes our way. You get sick, seriously sick. Your medical bills pile up. Then you find that they're getting kind of tired of this because you're not showing up at work, or you run out of sick days. And then you get a letter from the IRS that says that they would like to know more about your taxes, and on and on and on. This is the kind of suffering of suffering. I was just out at KTD and I met a woman who I've known for years. Let's see, it would have been 2 months ago. One of her sons went missing and has not been heard of since. The police have not been able to find him. She doesn't know what happened to her son, if he's alive or dead. Then another son got a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. The third son got another diagnosis. It might have been a bleeding ulcer. Let's just say she was in emotional turmoil. And this is the suffering of suffering. We train contemplating these three sufferings so that we're not overwhelmed by suffering when it comes, you might say, knocking on our door. If we don't have training, we get overwhelmed. We suffer tremendous anguish from these kinds of experiences. And if we look deeply, there is suffering that follows us around like a shadow. Whatever we are doing, there always is this underlying experience of things can change. We know deep inside of us that something could happen and make life very difficult for us, even if we deny it. I had some people that I'd never met here yesterday, and we were talking, and the woman looked at the cemetery, and even having a cemetery that close to her made her a little uncomfortable. She said she could not live with a cemetery that close to her. That's the first part, is meditating on and contemplating these three types of suffering. The next is to meditate and contemplate impermanence in relation to suffering. Look at the causes and conditions that bring about suffering. When we are suffering, we generally miss this. We focus on the pain. We don't focus on why did this happen? Because there were prior conditions, prior causes. If your son went missing, well, first of all, you had to have a son. You had to give birth to a son, and on and on and on. So analyze this at a very deep level. The third way to look at the truth of suffering is to meditate on emptiness. And again, this is conceptual, but the point is that the experience of suffering has no real essence. When you meditate the previous one on causes and conditions, you get to a level of intellectual understanding that the suffering has no real essence. The conditions and the causes, one after another, you can go back and back and back. That there was no really beginning. It's just a series of causes and conditions that led up to your present situation. So understanding how emptiness is related to suffering and that it has no essence eventually can come about, and it is necessary for it to come about in order to progress. The last one is meditation on selflessness, thinking about there is no permanent, unchanging self or soul, that we can talk about my body, my feelings, my emotions, my expectations, my possessions, whatever. These are a result of our mundane lives and our daily experience. The self is actually not that. Tralek Rinpoche talks about a functional self. And the idea is, if we really want to look at a self, it is dynamic, it's alive, it's constantly changing, it's a process. A functional self knows how to function within the mundane world, but is not fixed. It's fluid. It depends on conditions and causes, and knows that it is related to conditions. But if you don't have that understanding, we become fixed on the past unchanging, that we and will even fight change, deny change. And it, of course, becomes a real problem, because then the future becomes fixed too, and there's no room to grow and change. So that is the last of these contemplations and meditation. And again, the meditation is more of insight meditation than shamatha meditation. The second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. Very simply, all suffering in the world is due to the afflictive states of mind, our grasping and our clinging. These produce all the sufferings that have been mentioned. They produce poverty, war, injustice, and so forth. So the first contemplation here is about the truth of the origin of suffering. It involves causes. We have to go beyond the idea of the world is full of suffering. That's the way it is, and there's not much that can be done about it. Well, maybe I could go out and protest or sign a petition and so forth. But we have to go beyond that approach. We have to look at the causes. We have to go and see where suffering originates, how it is caused, the manner that it arises. So here again, doing some investigation, insight meditation, and so forth, and really get to know about the causes of suffering. Getting to know what anger is, the defects of anger, why you get angry, why you get frustrated, why you get irritated. Do other people get irritated at the same things you get irritated? I frequently will think or contemplate on these sorts of things. Didn't seem to irritate Rinpoche. Why can't I have more equanimity, and so forth? So this is about cause. The second contemplation is about effect. So here, investigate and contemplate what sort of effects are produced by certain causes. And with all of these contemplations, don't just parrot teachings that you've heard or read about. You need to come to your own conclusions. You need to come to certainty about these things. So the effect is about karma. And it would be things like, am I happy when I'm angry? Am I happy when I conquer a foe, if I can out-argue somebody? So it is to investigate these things, the result of your actions. And it's good to take, you might say, the long view rather than the short-term view, because what's really important is the long-term implications of our actions. The third contemplation here is to investigate appearance, which is looking at the experience of suffering. What does suffering feel like? Get to know it very, very well. Make friends with it. The fourth contemplation is about conditions. So we've talked about causes, effect, what it feels like. Now, what are the conditions that have to be present in order for the effect to come into being? So these four contemplations have one common aim, and that is to obtain a correct understanding of how things happen, how there is not a higher power in control. Actually, the more we understand this, the more ability we have to mitigate the effects of suffering. I sometimes say that difficulties are unavoidable. Suffering is optional. The third noble truth is the cessation of suffering. What this means is simply it's possible to end our experience of suffering, end our mental torment, that it is possible and it can be done, and that we are the ones that have the power to accomplish this, or perhaps to have the power to experience this. The first contemplation then is the conviction that impurities of mind can be eradicated, can be abandoned. So there's an element of faith, confidence, trust, and free of doubt. The doubt is extremely destructive to traveling the path. If you have doubt, you try a little bit and then you give up. Maybe you even try a lot, but then you give up. You don't have diligence. So conviction is confidence, faith, free of doubt. And this is something that develops too. When I finish talking about these four noble truths, I'll talk a little bit about how we progress, because there are different levels on this path, different stages you go through. The second contemplation is what is called, quote, contemplation of quiescence. And this means that suffering can be completely eradicated, that suffering at this point is no longer active in one's life when the truth of cessation manifests. So here again, we're gaining complete conviction of the possibility of attaining this permanent quiescence or cessation. The third contemplation is that of, quote, excellence. And this is the realization that the shamatha meditation experience is not the ultimate experience. It falls short of real spiritual practice. Shamatha meditation can calm our mind down, but it is unable to provide us with a final liberation. And it is only through vipassana that this is possible. So it's realizing that shamatha has its shortcomings and we have to go beyond shamatha. The last contemplation is renunciation. And this is realizing that all the defiling tendencies and emotions of our mind can be renounced and must be renounced, and that liberation can be attained as a result of this. Yalwan Karmapa has said, compassion turned inward towards oneself is renunciation. So that is this fourth contemplation about the truth of cessation. The last is the path that leads us out of suffering. So here are the contemplations related to that. First of all, is seeing the path as a vehicle that is capable of taking us out of samsara to nirvana. We look at the path as capable of bringing suffering to an end. We've done some contemplation in the previous truth about the truth of cessation. We realize that this path will assist us to accomplishing cessation. And of course, we have a strong desire to attain cessation, as opposed to a weak desire to attain cessation, or a desire to, well, I would like to have more pleasure in my present life, and then later on I will concern myself with this path. Or maybe I can work out a deal here in having more pleasure in samsara and then practicing from time to time. So it is really getting very serious about seeing the path as the way out and the only way out. The second contemplation on attainment, which we realize that the path we are following is the correct path, and we do not want to deviate from it. The third contemplation is that it's on liberation, that we realize by following the Eightfold Noble Path, we can achieve liberation. We can go beyond samsara and samsaric conditions. We can go beyond this world that we live in, that we're very familiar with and have, you might say, attachment to it. So by contemplating these Four Noble Truths this way, the practitioner goes through 4 different stages on this path. They are levels of attainment. I think that's a good way to put it. Again, all of this is to a certain extent about conceptual contemplations, but since it's being done with Vipassana meditation, there is a certain element of experience involved. And these levels partially are dependent on understanding causes and conditions and how deep the understanding is. So the first level of this path of junction is called heat. And it's not tumo in terms of a meditation that causes your body to stay warm and comfortable in cold situations. It is called heat because heat burns up, fire burns up wood, heat burns up the obstacles to attaining the next path, the path of seeing. So it could be said this is the heat from the fire of wisdom or fire of insight. So wisdom has the capacity to consume our defilements and our obscurations. There are 5 powers that are associated with traveling this path. They are tremendous devotion, enthusiasm, mindfulness, samadhi, one-pointed concentration, and wisdom. So these 5 powers were talked about in the path of accumulation. Well, they become stronger when you get on this path. And the second level is called the path of the summit or the peak. Here, these 5 powers have become stabilized. This is considered the peak of our experience, hence peak. The practitioner at this level is able to work with whatever arises and perfect all the positive qualities of a worldly person. This is important. It isn't until you attain the third path, the path of seeing, that you are considered a spiritual person. So there is insight here, but it is not the insight of a person that has experienced emptiness. So now these 5 powers are very, very strong. This tremendous devotion, enthusiasm, mindfulness, one-pointed concentration or samadhi, and wisdom. The third level is patience or endurance. This is not, you might say, ordinary or mundane patience. It is more like fearlessness. The practitioner is no longer afraid of concepts like emptiness. I remember during a question and answer session, Rinpoche was really more a statement that the student had. He just told Rinpoche, "I'm afraid of emptiness." Rinpoche's answer was, "I'm not." Emptiness can be frightening. The idea is that there is nothing solid, that things are impermanent and can change very quickly. And the idea of insubstantiality, all of these things can be, if not frightening, disconcerting, kind of throwing our ordinary world on its head or pulling the rug out from under it even. At this point, the practitioner has full confidence in this new reality, you might say, that they're no longer uncomfortable with these ideas. Again, these are still ideas. So real conviction develops into fearlessness. And you can bear pain and difficulties, hardships and problems. Well, like Milarepa, like Marpa, Naropa, Talopa, like these great Kagyu forefathers. So these 5 powers are now extremely strong and stable, and they're now called the 5 forces. The last level of this path of juncture is the path of attainment. And at this point, you have come to fruition all the worldly spiritual qualities. This level is called most excellent of dharmas, but it still is dharmas associated with worldly attainments. The attainment of excellent spiritual qualities is yet to come. Now, once the second level of this path has been attained, it's almost impossible to regress. Whatever qualities that you have developed will remain. Rinpoche uses the example of a person that has learned to play a musical instrument by playing it, of course, regularly. And this is intended to be an analogy to regular practice too. And even if the musician stops playing for even years, when they pick up the instrument, they again quickly are able to play it at a very skillful level. Whereas a person that is just half-heartedly played an instrument and they put it down and come back years later, they almost back to the beginning of learning how to play it. It is this way with Dharma practice. When you get to this level, it's very, very difficult to backslide and forget it. The level of supreme or excellent qualities, at that point, you are very close to the path of seeing. And when you actually see emptiness, you then are on the path of seeing. So there's a very fine line to the highest level of the path of junction and the path of seeing. One just flows right into the other. Finally, there's a brief explanation here of our meditation experiences. One is having a clear, stable, pleasant, and perhaps even enjoyable meditation experience. And we can have that experience when we meditate. Another experience is having a wild, unstable, sad, maybe even frightening experiences when we meditate. That things come up from our memory can make us very uncomfortable. If we're having the pleasant ones, we can become full of pride and fixate and even try to bring these experiences back when we meditate next time. And if we have the unpleasant ones, we can become discouraged or even frightened to the point where we don't want to do it. But it's important to remember that these are just temporary experiences occurring in our mind and to let go of them. Here are some signs of progress. One is the sign of purity. And this is that our negativities are reduced. We have less involvement with our afflictive states of mind. When difficulties arise, suffering increases, and so forth, we don't completely lose it and get totally overwhelmed. Another positive sign is the sign of understanding or realization that meditative concentration improves. Our faith and our devotion increase. So to just kind of sum this up, to go over these 4 stages here. Warmth is an increase in the 5 powers of devotion, enthusiasm, mindfulness, samadhi, and wisdom. Peak is the 5 powers have become stabilized. This is the highest level or the peak of our experience. Patience or endurance. The 5 powers now become the 5 forces. They have stabilized and become stronger. You can bear pain and difficulties, hardships, and so forth. The last is supreme dharma, and that is you might even experience emptiness. And at that point, you're on the path of seeing. You've become a bodhisattva. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. The question is it possible to regress when you're on the path of junction? Can you go back to the path of accumulation? It is until you get to a certain level, and then that part is irreversible. A follow-up question, and that is it possible when you are on the path of junction then to gain the insight and knowledge to see things differently and gain more information from being on the path of accumulation? I interpreted that to mean simply, is there a feedback mechanism? And of course, there is, that what you learn can be used to increase your understanding of ideas and experiences that you've had on the path of accumulation. The follow-up question, and it is, can you use meditations that you learned on the path of juncture if you're still on for things that you learned on the path of accumulation? And my answer is yes. The question is, how does samadhi fit into this path? It's certainly helpful because samadhi is meditative concentration, and it helps us calm our minds. And a calm mind is needed if we're going to do insight meditation. Otherwise, your mind is all over the place and it doesn't stay on a particular subject and investigate. It just goes to a subject and then it's something else, and you go there, and then there it reminds you of some other place, and pretty soon your mind is all over the place. And so a stable mind is really important to be able to do these contemplations in a very thorough and deep way. The question was a follow-up question about samadhi or meditative concentration. I would say that the amount of calmness or clarity or stability that we experience when we're meditating, it is very variable. That sometimes there might be very little, and sometimes there might be a lot. A good example would be you're stopped at a railroad crossing and there is a train going by. And the train is going by very fast and you can hardly see the space between the cars. But if the train slows down, you start seeing this space between the cars. And when we're meditating, if our mind is really busy, we don't see the space between the thoughts and the calmness there. But if our mind slows down, we start seeing there is space between the end of one thought and the beginning of another thought. And it can vary from moment to moment when we're meditating, but we can develop this, and over a period of time of practicing meditation and so forth, and gradually, again, one session is not going to be necessarily stable or better than another, but over time have more space between the thoughts.